The silver-plated nameplate on the mahogany table read Sarah Jenkins, but my father was looking right through it as if it were a pane of cheap glass. He didn't see the woman who spent 2 deployments pulling shrapnel out of screaming men in the high desert dust of Kandahar, or the risk analyst who now managed millions in corporate infrastructure. To him, I was just a line item he could no longer afford to balance. He leaned across the polished wood, the smell of his expensive cologne mixed with the faint, sour tang of panic sweating through his tailored suit, and whispered the words that broke 20 years of silent tolerance. "You are replaceable, Sarah. Do not forget that." Behind him, my mother let out a soft, wet laugh into her handkerchief. It wasn't a joke. He delivered the insult with his right hand extended, holding a demand for a 6-figure wire transfer to bail out his latest collapsing real estate venture. I didn't blink, I didn't yell. In my line of work, when a system begins to catastrophically fail, you don't argue with the alarm bells, you map the exit route. I looked at his fingers, slightly trembling against the wood, and then down at the worn nylon strap of the old trauma kit sitting inside my open briefcase on the floor. For a decade, I had been the invisible pillar keeping them upright, paying the lease on the luxury SUV he drove, securing the title on the Commonwealth Avenue apartment they slept in, and quietly absorbing the credit card bills my younger brother Garrett ran up under my auxiliary business profiles. They treated my income like a permanent birthright and my boundaries like a personal insult, entirely blind to the reality that every comfort in their lives existed solely because I allowed it. If Sarah Jenkins was a disposable asset, then the liabilities attached to my name could be deleted with a keystroke. Arthur thought he had backed his quiet daughter into a corner, using the heavy weight of family obligation. He had no idea that my firm's compliance board had already flagged the cloned corporate authentication card Garrett had been using in the shadows. He didn't know about the Alpha Direct restriction that had just locked my military files from his slick estate lawyers, or the encrypted ping currently waiting on my laptop from someone who only knew me by a serial number ending in 7 Delta. I slid the unsigned loan documents back across the mahogany, my hand perfectly steady. I stood up, buttoned my blazer, and looked my father dead in the eye, watching the first tiny crack of uncertainty flicker across his face as the silence stretched between us. "If value is denied, Arthur, the investment ends," I said, my voice dropping into a low, conversational register that carried the cold weight of a combat tourniquet. "From this second forward, you're going to learn exactly what it costs to replace me." The silence that followed my exit from the room felt thick, almost heavy enough to touch. I walked down the long, carpeted hallway of the office suite, the soft thud of my boots the only sound against the quiet. Behind me, through the heavy oak door I'd just closed, the muffled murmur of my father's voice started back up, sharp and strained, likely trying to spin my departure into another grievance for my mother's benefit. I didn't stop to listen. Outside, the Boston air hit me like a physical slap. It was late afternoon, the sky a dull, bruised purple over the financial district. I stood on the granite steps of the building for a second, pulling the collar of my coat tight against a sudden, damp gust of wind. My hands were perfectly steady, but my chest felt tight, the skin over my collarbone prickling with a heat that had nothing to do with the weather. I took a deep breath, letting the cold air clear out the lingering scent of my father's cologne and the suffocating weight of their expectations. I didn't get into my car right away. Instead, I walked 2 blocks down to a small, nondescript coffee shop tucked into a brick alleyway. It was a place where nobody knew my name or my title, a quiet corner where I could simply be an anonymous face in a city full of people rushing home to their own lives. The shop smelled of burnt espresso grounds and damp umbrellas. I ordered a black coffee, my fingers wrapping around the thick paper cup, using the heat to anchor myself to the present moment. I sat at a small stool by the window, watching the rain start to streak the glass in long, jagged lines. Looking out at the wet pavement, my mind drifted, slipping past the immediate sting of the confrontation and dropping straight back into the dust. It was an involuntary pivot, a mental reflex I'd been trying to train out of myself for 3 years, but the anger always acted like a key in an old lock. Suddenly, I wasn't in Boston anymore. I was back in the cramped, oven-like interior of an armored vehicle outside of Sangan, the air thick with the smell of scorched copper, sweat, and the alkaline sting of battery acid. I remembered the heavy, exhausting weight of the body armor pressing into my ribs as I leaned over a kid from Ohio who couldn't have been older than 19. His eyes were wide, vacant with the shock of a sudden blast, his fingers clawing at the fabric of my sleeve as his pulse fluttered like a trapped bird under my palms. In that specific, terrifying space, there was no room for negotiation or false pride. The universe didn't care about your family lineage or what social circle you claimed. It only cared about whether you could stop the bleeding before the clock ran out. That was the reality that had shaped the adult version of Sarah Jenkins. It was a gritty, unvarnished baseline that my family could never quite comprehend. To Arthur, my time in uniform was just a historical footnote, a phase I went through before stepping into a corporate position he could try to leverage. He viewed my career through the lens of potential loans and credit score access, completely blind to the fact that the person who survived those dusty medics' tents was no longer the malleable, guilt-driven daughter he remembered. I took a slow sip of the coffee, the bitter taste bringing me back to the window. The contradiction in my own thoughts was the hardest part to swallow. For years, a small, irrational part of me had kept the checkbook open, quietly absorbing their debts and covering their deficits, misinterpreting that enablement as a form of daughterly loyalty. I had let myself believe that if I just carried the weight long enough, if I solved enough of Arthur's self-inflicted emergencies, the dynamic would eventually shift into something resembling mutual respect. It was a foolish calculation, an emotional error in judgment from someone who prided herself on clinical risk assessment. The text message that buzzed on my phone 15 minutes later broke the trance. It wasn't from my parents. It was a notification from my firm's automated security ledger, indicating an unauthorized credential verification attempt on my secondary database profile. The location data attached to the alert mapped directly back to a commercial address downtown, Arthur's real estate office. I stared at the glowing screen, a cold, hard certainty settling into my stomach. The confrontation in the office hadn't been an isolated outburst of frustration. It was a distraction. While my father had been attempting to leverage my emotions to secure a signature, something far more calculated was moving in the digital dark. I deleted the notification, my thumb clicking twice against the glass to lock the immediate port. I stood up, tossing the half-empty coffee cup into the bin, and stepped back out into the rain. The time for passive observation was entirely over. They wanted to treat my life and my career as a communal resource they could harvest at will, but they had fundamentally misjudged the operator they were dealing with. As I walked back toward my vehicle, the wet asphalt shining under the streetlights, I knew the next 24 hours wouldn't be about arguments or family meetings. It would be an audit. And an audit carries no sentiment. The windshield wipers on my sedan fought a losing battle against the sheets of water, blurring the Boston skyline into a smear of gray and neon. I drove in silence, the dashboard lights casting a dull blue glow over my hands. Every mechanical click of the signal indicator felt loud, an artificial pulse in a car that suddenly felt too small. My mind was already parsing the data from that security alert. Arthur's office had tried to access my corporate footprint while he was still practicing his speech in the boardroom. It was a coordinated play, a tactical pincer movement executed with the clumsy desperation of a man who knew his floor was caving in. By 5:30 a.m. the next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the city wrapped in a cold, heavy fog that smelled of wet asphalt and salt from the harbor. I didn't go to the office downtown. Instead, I sat at my steel kitchen table, the early light cutting pail streaks through the blinds. The apartment was completely quiet. On the corner of the table, the coarse nylon strap of my old combat trauma kit rubbed against the aluminum edge of my corporate laptop. It was a physical anchor. It reminded me of a time when the stakes were measured in seconds and skin, not credit limits and lease agreements. I opened the master management portal for my personal and secondary business accounts. My fingers moved across the trackpad without hesitation. 2 clicks. That was all it took to remove Arthur and Alina from the supplementary credit lines I'd established for them 5 years ago when Arthur's primary consultancy firm went under. No warnings. No automated emails would hit their devices. The bank only notified the primary account holder when user access was revoked. It was astonishing how quickly a decade of artificial dependency could be undone when the person writing the checks simply stopped authorizing the signature. Next came the mobility subsidies. I pulled up the fleet leasing portal tied to my corporate security consulting profile. The European SUV my father drove to his country club meetings, and the compact sedan my mother used for her boutique grocery runs were both registered under my name to secure the commercial underwriting rate. I filed an immediate vehicle return request, scheduling the vehicle repossession for the end of the fiscal week, and canceled the multi-car insurance coverage. Finally, I reached the cellular network logs. I called our enterprise telecom representative directly. "Enterprise verification, Sarah Jenkins," I said, my voice cutting through the early morning static of the line. "I need a complete separation of the 3 secondary lines on my master family data contract. Ms. Jenkins, the system indicates those lines have significant historical data rollovers and device upgrade options attached," the representative replied, her voice smooth with standard corporate neutrality. "If we decouple them, each user will be required to establish an individual consumer contract, including an independent credit inquiry and a standard market deposit." "Process it," I said, "effective immediately." I signed the electronic authorization with a steady hand. It wasn't an act of revenge. It was a standard administrative correction. For years, my family had treated my high-level clearance and my salary as an alternative to personal planning, operating under the assumption that biological connection eliminated the need for financial autonomy. But as the telecom dashboard updated, a sharp anomaly caught my eye. The system flagged a ghost data cloning protocol running on my auxiliary business line, the secure number I used for two-factor authentication when accessing my firm's off-site risk infrastructure servers. The duplicate signal wasn't hidden well. It was a crude, persistent mirror that had been active for nearly 6 months, routing every security verification token directly to an unlisted IP address located in Arthur's commercial office suite. I leaned closer to the monitor, the cold steel of the table pressing into my forearms. My younger brother, Garrett, didn't have the technical depth to code a SIM clone bypass. He could barely manage his own online banking credentials. Arthur had engineered this. He hadn't just been asking for loans. He had been systematically harvesting my professional identity in the shadows, using my clean security profile to clear automated bank filters and shadow register a series of shell LLCs to hide his real estate debts from federal underwriters. If those ventures collapsed, the primary legal liability wouldn't touch his office. It would land directly on Sarah Jenkins. My personal phone buzzed against the table, the sharp vibration making the ceramic coffee mug rattle. It was a text from Garrett, the phrasing exactly what Arthur would have dictated. "Sarah, Mom's blood pressure is spiking after what you did in the office yesterday. You're causing a massive medical crisis over numbers. Just sign the temporary asset release and let's talk like a family." I stared at the screen. The contradiction in their behavior was finally transparent. They used the language of family collectivism and moral duty to police my boundaries, while simultaneously using corporate espionage to hollow out my security from the inside. They didn't want my support. They wanted a permanent subsidy with no expiration date, no negotiation, and no recognition of the labor required to maintain it. I didn't reply to the paragraph. I typed a single, direct sentence into the secure messaging terminal, routing it to Garrett's decoupled device. "The mirror line is dead, Garrett. Tell Arthur the underwriting on his shell company carries a 10-year federal minimum." I closed the laptop, the crisp click signaling the end of the extraction phase. The silence returned to the kitchen, heavier now, but clean. The cracks in their mirror were wide enough to see the decay underneath, and the first wave of declines was about to hit the pavement. The rain started again just after noon, a heavy, relentless gray sheet that turned the high-rise windows of my office into a blurred watercolor of downtown Boston. From the 24th floor, the city looked small, silent, and entirely trapped under the weather. Inside my workspace, the climate control hummed a flat, mechanical monotone. The air was clean, smelling faintly of the ozone from the server racks and the fresh carpet tile. I sat at my desk, my fingers motionless over the keyboard. On the secondary screen, the forensic trace of Arthur's cloned IP address remained frozen, a permanent digital stain. At 2:14 p.m., my phone buzzed against the dark mahogany. It didn't ring. It just hummed 3 times, a low, urgent vibration that made the ceramic coaster under my cold tea rattle. The display read Alina. I didn't answer. I leaned back, my posture rigid, watching the screen pulse until the notification expired and rolled over into a voicemail icon. I waited exactly 60 seconds, letting the audio file compress and process through our firm's security filters, before I tapped the speaker link on my tablet. My mother's voice burst into the sterile room. It was sharp, breathing heavily, laced with a shrill panic that didn't quite hide the underlying fury. Sarah, what is going on with the cards?" she gasped, the background noise filled with the distinct clatter of shopping carts and public murmuring. "I'm at the Dartmouth Street Market. The cashier just ran my card twice and it rejected. Hard decline, Sarah." Right there on the screen. The entire line behind me is waiting, staring at me like I'm trying to steal groceries. It is completely humiliating. Call the bank and fix this glitch right now. I stared at the speaker. The diagnosis of her panic was clear. She wasn't worried about hunger, she was terrified of the cashier's judgment. She cared about the appearance of wealth, never the operational cost of maintaining it. To Alina, my name and my corporate title existed simply to shield her from the friction of a checkout counter. I closed the audio file. I didn't call the bank. I opened the secure chat interface and sent a single text response. "The line is inactive. Please utilize your personal debit account." The gray typing bubbles appeared within 3 seconds. They bounced frantically, vanished, then reappeared as her internal script short-circuited against the reality of a hard boundary. The block of text arrived. "What do you mean inactive? This is a basic necessity, Sarah. Groceries are a household expense you are supposed to cover. I am your mother. Do you honestly expect me to carry cash like a common vagrant?" I looked at the phrase "supposed to cover." It was the language of permanent entitlement. I typed a final, clinical clarification. A decline transaction is the normal outcome when a primary account holder revokes user access. You have full financial autonomy, Alina. Use your own funds. The bubbles flickered once, then went dark. The line died. 45 minutes later, my direct office landline rang. The digital display flagged an external call routing through a private proxy server. I picked up the receiver, brought it to my ear, and remained silent. Arthur's heavy, shallow breathing filled the static before he spoke. When he did, his baritone was tight, stripped of the theatrical warmth he used for federal judges or potential investors. It was a low, vibrating growl. "You are actively trying to publicly humiliate your own parents, Sarah Jenkins," he hissed, the words clipped. I was in the middle of a private luncheon at the Harvard Club, entertaining an institutional lender for the real estate portfolio, when my primary corporate card suffered a hard rejection. "You locked the account from your office terminal. Do you have any conception of the damage you've caused to my professional standing?" I kept my eyes locked on the data trace, my voice dropping into a flat, level register. "Choosing not to finance your business lunches is standard corporate underwriting, Arthur, not an insult. If your real estate portfolio requires my auxiliary credit line to maintain the appearance of liquidity, then the portfolio is already dead. The market just hasn't processed the paperwork yet. You should feel an overwhelming sense of shame." His voice rose, his breathing tightening as his control fractured. "Other daughters would be proud to support the father who paved the way for their advancement. If the roles were reversed, I would never deny you structural support." I remembered the medic's tents in Kandahar. I remembered the smell of copper and the unyielding weight of the tourniquet bands in my nylon kit. Arthur had never stood in a space where reality couldn't be manipulated by a speech or a tailored suit. "When was the last time you supported anyone without attaching a debt of entitlement to the transaction, Arthur?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer. The line exploded into a brief burst of static as he slammed his fist against his desk. "Reinstate the corporate cards by the end of the business day, Sarah. This is no longer a request." "The audit is closed, Arthur," I said. I hung up the receiver, placing it gently back into the cradle. I didn't shake, I didn't sweat. I simply returned my fingers to the keyboard and continued reviewing the data logs. The first structural lines had been cut, and the family facade was officially bleeding out. The rain didn't stop. It settled over the city like a heavy, cold wool blanket, turning the brick alleys below my apartment into slick, black canals. I sat at my steel kitchen table at 9:00 p.m., the single overhead halogen bulb casting a sharp, clinical circle of light across the metal surface. Outside, the steady, rhythmic drumming of water against the building's iron fire escape kept my pulse anchored to a rigid baseline. On the corner of the table, the faded nylon of my old combat first aid kit sat open. I reached out, my fingers tracing the stiff, coarse texture of the tourniquet bands. It was a sensory callback to a world where lines were absolute. In the desert, you either stopped the hemorrhage or you lost the patient. There was no middle ground. There was no room for a well-crafted lie to alter the outcome. I needed that physical reminder tonight, because the domestic system I had spent a decade funding was undergoing a total structural collapse. At 9:14 p.m., the phone on the table vibrated violently, its plastic casing rattling against the steel. The screen lit up with Garrett's name. I didn't rush to pick it up. I let it hum 3 times, establishing my own rhythm before sliding the bar to answer. I brought the phone to my ear and kept my mouth shut. Sarah, you need to call off the bank fraud alerts right now." Garrett's voice burst through the receiver, high-pitched and ragged. In the background, the heavy, metallic thrumming of a large diesel engine competed with the roar of a downpour hitting a tin canopy. I'm stranded at the Shell station on Tremont. The pump just swallowed the gas card with an absolute fraud code. The attendant behind the glass is looking at me like I'm a criminal. And he says the truck's registration is flagged on his terminal for an immediate corporate asset repossession. I can't even turn the key without the dashboard screen screaming at me. Fix this. I pulled up the enterprise vehicle database on my laptop with my left hand, the keys clicking softly under my touch. My eyes scanned the active lines. The vehicle is not yours, Garrett. The lease on that diesel truck is registered under my corporate risk consulting profile. I terminated the mobility subsidy 48 hours ago. You are currently operating an unauthorized liability on public roads. It's a car, Sarah. It's my transportation. He shouted, his voice cracking with that familiar, ugly mix of panic and unearned entitlement our father had cultivated in him since he was old enough to hold a wallet. Dad told me you were acting like a ruthless landlord, but this is a total betrayal. We're a family. I need to get across town tonight to meet a guy. Fuel prices are through the roof, and you're treating your own brother like an enemy. I looked at the data stream on my screen, my voice dropping into a flat, level register. Family unity is a bilateral contract, Garrett. You provide zero input to the ledger. You are 26 years old. You have no independent credit score, no active tax filings, and your version of adult autonomy is a financial pipeline tied directly to my salary. Why are you driving a $60,000 truck with chrome trim when you don't earn a wage? Because Dad said the family resources handled the payments. Garrett screamed back, his psychological defense mechanisms completely fracturing under the sudden weight of real-world economic friction. He told me the Shell company structured the lease through your enterprise portal to secure the multi-car insurance discount. He said your name was just a regulatory technicality to bypass the standard consumer credit check. I stopped typing. The room felt incredibly quiet beneath the sound of the rain. The hidden connection I had unraveled during the forensic audit solidified on the screen in front of me. Arthur hadn't just been lazy, he had been predatory. "Listen to me with absolute clarity, Garrett," I said, my voice quiet, carrying the cold finality of a combat triage assessment. Arthur did not use my name for a discount. He forced you to sign the Articles of Incorporation for a Shadow Real Estate LLC, utilized your clean name as the managing member, and then cloned my corporate authentication card to clear the bank's automated underwriting filters. He left you holding the legal title to a bankrupt shell company, while he used my credit profile as the ultimate, hidden guarantor. You aren't his business partner, Garrett. You are his legal crumple zone. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the line, completely replacing his angry shouting. The only sound remaining was the rhythmic, hollow thumping of the rain against the gas station canopy miles away. The brother who had spent years framing my financial boundaries as pure greed finally realized that the patriarch he blindly defended had used him as disposable ammunition. What am I supposed to do, Sarah?" he whispered. He sounded completely stripped of his armor now, his voice dropping into the exact tone of a terrified boy. "The truck won't even register the transponder code. If the police scan the plate, it rolls over to a grand theft alert. Leave the keys with the station attendant, step away from the vehicle, and walk to the nearest transit station," I instructed him. "The American economic model rewards active participation, Garrett, not blind compliance to a bankrupt hierarchy. Earning a small paycheck will teach you the true value of gasoline. Welcome to adulthood. The bus passes are cash only." I ended the call before he could offer another excuse. I closed the laptop screen, the mechanical click signaling the end of the extraction phase. The silence returned to the kitchen, heavier now, but clean. The cracks in their mirror were wide enough to see the decay underneath, and the first wave of declines was about to hit the pavement. The morning air inside the high-end offices of Vantage Property Management was thick with the scent of premium floor wax, fresh printing toner, and cold, circulating air. Located on the 16th floor of a polished steel and glass tower in the financial district, the space was an architectural temple to corporate security. Every surface was rendered in brushed aluminum, smoky glass, and dark, flawless mahogany. There were no decorative illusions here, only the quiet, relentless hum of a multi-million-dollar enterprise tracking its urban liabilities. I sat at the primary conference table, my posture rigid, adjusting the cuffs of my navy corporate blazer. Across from me sat Evelyn Vance, the senior leasing counsel for the management firm. She was a sharp-featured woman with silvering hair and gold-rimmed spectacles, her eyes scanning a thick manila folder with practiced, clinical detachment. "Ms. Jenkins, your family's occupancy at the Commonwealth Avenue brownstone is legally tethered to your personal guarantor framework," Evelyn said, sliding a multi-page contract across the table. Her fingernails tapped against the paper with a precise, metric rhythm. "If we execute an early lease termination based on your sudden asset lockdown, your parents will receive a mandatory 14-day notice to quit. Arthur Jenkins, legal representation, has already submitted an opposition brief to our corporate office, claiming marital and filial dependency clauses protect their physical tenure. They are threatening a public injunction." The word dependency hit my eardrums like a concussive wave, instantly triggering a sharp, visceral echo of my time in Helmand Province. The sterile air of the conference room vanished, replaced by the dry, choking heat of a forward operating field hospital. I could taste the bitter dust between my teeth. I could hear the tearing friction of Velcro being ripped from a tactical medical kit. And I could see the desperate, demanding eyes of wounded operators who had lost all control over their immediate survival. My right hand instinctively drifted toward my laptop bag, my fingers brushing against the rigid, cold rim of my grandfather's steel challenge coin through the nylon fabric. "Hold the iron." I cleared my throat, forcing my voice into a flat, rhythmic cadence that matched the clinical environment. "The dependency argument is an underwritten fantasy, Evelyn," I stated, sliding a certified corporate asset affidavit across the mahogany table. "Vantage Property Management evaluates transactional risk based on verified liquidity and independent credit reporting, not ancestral pride. I am withdrawing my guarantor signature effective immediately. I have already deposited the high-penalty liquidation fee from my auxiliary corporate account, and I have placed a permanent fraud alert on my federal credit file." Evelyn adjusted her glasses, studying the corporate seal on my affidavit. A sudden, sharp frown creased the bridge of her nose. She turned to her dual-monitor workstation, her fingers clicking rapidly against the mechanical keyboard as she bypassed the public interface and logged into the secure resident data portal. "Ms. Jenkins, this is highly irregular," she muttered, her eyes darting frantically between the data streams on her screens. "We received a digital signature approving a full 3-year lease extension on that exact Commonwealth Avenue unit less than 6 hours ago. The electronic metadata indicates it was fully authorized using your primary corporate credentials and your verified routing numbers." I did not blink. I didn't lean forward. The psychological trap Arthur had set was sophisticated, but he had fundamentally miscalculated my operational discipline and my knowledge of data link security. Check the biometric security protocol on that specific authorization, Evelyn, I said quietly, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. She clicked through the secondary validation logs, her face losing its color as the system metadata unraveled before her. It passed the initial alphanumeric password verification, but the system flagged a hard biometric mismatch. The network protocol requested a secondary retinal or thumbprint scan to finalize the guarantor debt. The scan failed 3 consecutive validation attempts, automatically triggering a silent, permanent hold on the contract. The tactical payoff of my digital audit from Chapter 2 had landed with absolute, mathematical precision. Arthur hadn't just tried to guilt me into compliance over text messages. He had actively attempted to forge my legal identity to anchor me to a $250,000 housing liability. But because I had locked my master files behind strict biometric parameters, the moment I discovered Garrett's cloned SIM card, my father's desperate attempt at legal entrapment had fractured against the automated underwriting system. "That is not a lease extension," I told the attorney, standing up and buttoning my blazer with a steady hand. "That is a felony corporate forgery executed against a defense infrastructure employee. Issue the eviction protocol immediately. Let the market show them the true, unmitigated cost of their lifestyle." The tactical arena shifted violently from real estate contracts to the very foundation of my professional survival. On Monday morning at precisely 10:14 a.m., I sat in the secure, glass-enclosed briefing room at our corporate headquarters. A high-stakes infrastructure risk report for an impending executive board review lay open on the dark mahogany table before me. The environment inside was an absolute sanctuary: soundproofed glass walls, encrypted data links, a clean, scentless atmosphere that felt light years away from the suffocating pressure of my family. Suddenly, the phone on the table vibrated, its plastic casing humming a low, mechanical monotone against the wood. The encrypted internal display flagged an incoming call routing through our main backline extension. I picked up the device, stepped into a private, soundproof alcove, and brought the receiver to my ear. I did not speak. I waited for the line to declare itself. "You have profoundly underestimated the scope of your liabilities, Sarah." My father's voice delivered a cold, measured baritone over the encrypted network. He wasn't yelling anymore. The desperate domestic shouting from the gas station had been entirely scrubbed away, replaced by a calculated, terrifyingly professional cadence. "I am standing exactly 3 blocks from your corporate headquarters. In my briefcase, I hold a fully documented, unredacted compliance dossier." I leaned my back against the cold glass pane of the alcove, my heart rate spiking to 130 BPM. My combat triage training took over instantly, overriding the sudden surge of adrenaline. Assess the damage, isolate the bleed, clear the airway. My internal monologue fell into a familiar, rigid rhythm, a survival mechanism forged in the dust of Kandahar while patching up torn flesh under fire. Arthur was launching a coordinated pincer movement, but he was doing it on my terrain. "Identify the asset, Arthur," I said, my voice dropping into a low, conversational register. "What do you think you possess?" "I possess your unredacted deployment logs from your time with the 82nd Airborne, your complete psychological evaluation files from your veteran transition program, and a comprehensive narrative detailing your systematic abandonment of your aging, medically vulnerable parents," he said, his tone dripping with a chilling paternal condescension that made the skin over my collarbone prickle. "Our legal team has mapped this data directly to your firm's strict public trust and moral character compliance clauses. If I deliver this packet to your executive board before your noon presentation, your security clearance will be frozen for an internal investigation. Your career will be dead by lunch." The extortion was absolute. Arthur had spent his entire life manipulating social structures, and he was now weaponizing the elite corporate compliance systems I respected to force me back into financial submission. He wanted me to blink. He expected me to offer a 6-figure wire transfer right there over the phone just to keep the dirty water of our family dynamic from spilling into my pristine workspace. I looked down at my hand holding the receiver. It was perfectly steady. The sensory memory of the morning audit, the crisp click of my laptop closing after I cut their credit lines, anchored me to the present. Arthur thought he was holding a knife to my throat, but he didn't understand the underwriting of the system he was trying to leverage. "You do not possess my unredacted deployment logs, Arthur," I said, my delivery flat, cutting through his manufactured leverage. "Those specific files are classified under an Alpha Direct restriction. If you have those documents in that briefcase, you have violated federal data laws, and you are currently holding classified defense infrastructure." "I have more than enough to trigger the internal audit, Sarah," he fired back, a sudden, jagged edge of panic tearing through his professional mask. "Reinstate the corporate credit lines and withdraw the Commonwealth eviction notice by 11:30 a.m., or I walk through your security lobby. The choice is entirely yours." The line went dead with a sharp digital click. The spring was compressed to its absolute breaking point, the tension heavy enough to fill the small alcove. But instead of yielding to the blackmail, I executed an immediate tactical counteroffensive. I did not panic, and I did not run to the lobby to intercept him. I immediately downloaded the digital audio file of the extortion call, automatically captured and encrypted by our firm's secure line software, and forwarded it directly to our internal cybersecurity and internal affairs divisions. Because my private security firm handled high-level defense infrastructure, Arthur's threat to manipulate our compliance board crossed the legal line from a domestic dispute into federal corporate extortion. By trying to attack my professional sanctuary, he had just painted a massive, glowing infrared target on his own forehead. I walked back into the briefing room and opened my laptop, my fingers moving across the keyboard with a steady, deliberate rhythm. The audit was no longer mine. It belonged to the state. By Wednesday afternoon, the secondary line of Arthur's defensive perimeter suffered a catastrophic structural failure. I sat at my corporate desk, the high-resolution monitors casting a cool, geometric glow across my face. An internal security log displayed an active update. A federal protective detail had been quietly attached to my corporate assets following the extortion trace. The system was doing its job. Then my personal phone lit up. It vibrated against the dark mahogany desk, an urgent, erratic pattern that broke the room's clinical silence. It was Alina. I picked up the receiver and brought it to my ear. I did not say hello, I simply listened to the line. Her voice hit the microphone like shattered glass, a high-pitched, breathless shriek that instantly bounced off the soundproofed walls of my office. In the background, I could hear the distinct, clinical hum of a large medical facility, the muffled announcement of a public paging system, and the rhythmic rustle of plastic clipboards. "Sarah, how dare you? How dare you do this to us?" She wept, her voice thick with a carefully rehearsed, panicked desperation. I am standing inside the billing alcove at the Bellevue Medical Clinic. The receptionist just looked me directly in the eye and told me my health insurance card is completely invalid. They are refusing to authorize my elective cardiac screening unless I provide a $2,500 cash deposit right now. Fix this glitch this instant. I adjusted my headset, my hand completely steady. My eyes remained locked on a data spreadsheet mapping the asset layout of Arthur's failing shell companies. "Your dependent coverage was legally terminated 3 weeks ago, Alina. I submitted the electronic exemption forms along with your verified independent income statements. The state-based marketplace exchange handles your demographics now. You were sent 3 separate notifications to your personal portal. This is literal violence, Sarah Jenkins," she screamed, her voice cracking as she leaned heavily into her moral script. "A daughter has a sacred, moral obligation to secure the physical comfort of the parents who raised her. You are poisoning our bloodline for the sake of numbers." The receptionist is staring at me right now like I'm a vagrant on the street. I watched a line of code execute on my secondary screen. The receptionist is staring at you because you are demanding a premium elective service without a valid payment structure. The United States insurance system does not recognize adult children as legal guarantors for independent adults. The price you are facing at that counter is the exact cost I have been silently absorbing through my paycheck for 10 years. The only difference is that the system has finally handed you the invoice. "We can't afford it," she sobbed, dropping her moral superiority for a desperate gamble. Her breathing became loud and shallow, mimicking a sudden physical crisis. Arthur's heart cannot take this stress, Sarah. He needs to enroll in the high-tier executive medical protection plan this week, or his entire medical history will be left completely unprotected. If he has an episode, his blood is on your hands. I stopped tracking the spreadsheet. The air inside the office felt incredibly clear. The high-tier executive medical protection plan. The phrase hung in the silence of my internal monologue, triggering a rapid diagnostic analysis. In my line of work, we analyzed those specific financial products regularly. It wasn't a standard healthcare policy designed for medical wellness or patient care. It was a highly specialized, high-premium asset-shielding mechanism utilized in the corporate sector to legally root and protect liquid cash from impending bankruptcy courts. The final twist of the insurance war crystallized in real time on my monitor. Arthur wasn't facing an immediate medical emergency, and Alina wasn't lacking basic care. They were trying to use my remaining dependent signatures to root Arthur's hidden cash reserves into an untouchable insurance trust before his commercial real estate shell companies collapsed into federal liquidation. They wanted my name to validate a financial shell game. "Tell Arthur the underwriting is closed," I said, my voice quiet, flat, and entirely devoid of hesitation. The law protects employees from intimidation, and it certainly doesn't underwrite fraudulent asset shielding. Good luck with the marketplace paperwork. I ended the call, placing the phone face down on the mahogany surface. The silence that returned to the room was heavy, clinical, and absolute. The administrative firewall was completely locked down. Every digital port was closed, and my family was entirely out of time. They had one card left to play, a raw, public ambush on my own physical terrain. By Friday afternoon, the financial chokehold I had placed on my family forced them out of the digital shadows and into my physical space. I stepped out of the heavy glass doors of my corporate headquarters, the crisp, bitter air of the downtown plaza hitting my face. The sky above was a bruising shade of slate gray, casting long, stark shadows across the concrete. As I navigated the wide plaza, my eyes locked onto three figures waiting near the precise boundary line where the private granite columns met the public sidewalk. Arthur, Alina, and Garrett. They stood shoulder to shoulder, stripped of the luxury European vehicles and corporate gas cards that had once given them their unearned armor. Arthur's posture was stiff, his jaw clenched, though I could instantly see the micro-tears and fraying fabric along the cuffs of his tailored charcoal suit. Alina looked small, huddled into a wool coat, her eyes scanning the passing corporate crowd with deep anxiety. Garrett stood slightly behind them, shifting his weight nervously from foot to foot, looking entirely out of place in the sharp financial district. Alina stepped forward first, her hand reaching out to grab my forearm to pull me toward a recessed, private service corridor. "Sarah, please, walk with us over here. We shouldn't be exposed like this in front of your coworkers." I planted my boots firmly on the concrete, refusing to move an inch. "We can speak right here, Alina. The sidewalk is perfectly functional. Secrecy is the only instrument that allowed your old system to survive." Arthur stepped into my personal space, dropping the screaming rage of his previous phone calls. He adopted a chillingly calm, condescending paternal tone. He opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a crisp, multi-page document, thrusting it toward my chest. "We don't have time for your corporate theatrics, Sarah Jenkins," Arthur said, his baritone voice dropping low. The Vantage eviction protocol was processed. The landlord at the new complex on Beacon Hill requires an immediate income verification and a high-net-worth lease guarantor due to our restructured credit profiles. Your signature on this document restores our stability. It ensures we maintain the standard of living our family legacy demands. I did not take the paperwork. I let my arms hang loosely at my sides, my right hand lightly brushing the outline of the steel challenge coin in my pocket. A lease guarantor is a binding financial liability, Arthur, not a family symbol. The American rental market evaluates risk through mathematical metrics, not nostalgia. If I sign that, your lifestyle risks convert directly into my personal debt. Garrett interrupted, his face pale, his voice a frantic pitch. "Sarah, it's just for 1 year, just 12 months until Dad's commercial shell accounts clear bankruptcy underwriting. It keeps the family together." I still need help with the transportation and phone baselines anyway. Don't be so dramatic. 1 year is sufficient to permanently ruin a prime credit score, Garrett, I said, turning my gaze to him. Are you planning to build independent data, or do you intend to attach yourself to my paycheck indefinitely? Support without effort is dependency. Dependency without accountability is extraction. Arthur's face flushed a deep, violent crimson. He stepped even closer, his eyes drilling into mine. Your generation has forgotten the price of gratitude. Loyalty is measured by economic sacrifice, Sarah. If you refuse to secure your parents' shelter, you are morally defective. I will formally disown you before the sun sets. You will be dead to this lineage. My clearance is audited, Arthur, and my identity doesn't rely on your approval, I said quietly, looking him dead in the eye. And your lineage doesn't function as collateral. From this exact moment, all future requests for communication must arrive strictly through my corporate email inbox. I will not discuss assets, housing, or logistics on public pavements, in parking lots, or over personal phone lines. Arthur raised his hand, his voice catching in his throat to shout a final threat, but he froze. 2 plainclothes corporate security details from my firm stepped out from the shadows of the granite columns, their eyes locked on his movements, their earpieces glinting in the fading light. Arthur looked at the guards, then back at my unblinking expression. For the first time in his life, the patriarch realized that his psychological intimidation was entirely powerless against the corporate and legal firewall I had built around my life. He slowly lowered his hand, his mouth twisting into a silent, bitter line. He turned on his heel and walked away into the gray downtown crowd, dragging Alina and Garrett behind him. I watched them go, turned around, and walked to my vehicle with absolute clarity. Boundaries are not cruelty. They are risk management. The winter transition arrived with an absolute structural indifference. 3 months after the sidewalk confrontation outside my headquarters, the relentless financial friction I had applied to my family's infrastructure completely cured their capacity for performance. The quiet that settled between us wasn't a product of dramatic anger, silent treatments, or calculated emotional theater. It was the functional silence of logistics. When the unearned capital stopped traveling in one direction, our entire relationship shifted into a framework of objective reality. Without my high-tier credit profile and corporate guarantor framework to hide behind, my family's manufactured illusion of status suffered a total systemic collapse. They could not force their way into the high-end Beacon Hill complex, nor could they secure any property requiring standard risk underwriting. My automated corporate security alerts, which I monitored weekly to trace any secondary liability attempts under my name, tracked their forced migration to a basic, commercial motel on the industrial outskirts of the city. Inside that space, their housing payments operated on a rigid, cash-in-hand weekly basis. It wasn't a cinematic tragedy, though the erratic text paragraphs Alina occasionally sent to my archive folder treated the transition like an unprovoked human rights violation rather than standard mathematics. In the United States housing market, weekly rent is the precise economic pricing mechanism for individuals with ruined documentation and zero independent identity. That lack of a lease became their new, authentic baseline. A month after that, the data logs showed they shifted again, settling into an unrenovated 2-bedroom apartment near the commuter rail lines. The unit entirely lacked the polished hardwood floors and lavender-scented aesthetics they had previously demanded at my expense. I never issued a critique of the downgrade, nor did I offer a shred of pity. I did the opposite. Living within the exact boundaries of your verified capacity is the first real requirement of adulthood, and adulthood does not require applause. It requires accurate arithmetic. The most profound structural twist, however, unraveled within Garrett. With his cloned corporate SIM card permanently deactivated and his automotive gas allowances deleted, my younger brother was forced to enter an unfeeling labor market that cared absolutely nothing about his personal narratives of family unity. Because his resume possessed zero consistency and his name carried no verifiable professional footprint, he was forced to accept a grueling, entry-level position at a local commercial logistics warehouse, sorting heavy freight during the graveyard shift. I did not observe his psychological process directly, but the data told the story with flawless clarity. I received an automated credit bureau notification because his profile had finally uncoupled from my secondary corporate insurance policies. Garrett had successfully applied for and opened his very first independent, secured credit card. It carried a tiny $500 limit, backed entirely by his own earned cash deposit. My total refusal had not destroyed him. My prolonged generosity had been the precise mechanism keeping him paralyzed. The moment the subsidy died, his learned helplessness vanished. He discovered the exact value of a gallon of fuel the moment he had to spend 8 hours of manual labor to afford the transaction. Arthur, too, returned to the active workforce out of pure structural survival. He took a lower-tier, commission-based independent consulting position with a local commercial brokerage. The market did not care about his fragile patriarch ego, his tailored charcoal suits, or his age. It only cared about whether he could close data tasks in exchange for direct compensation. He stopped blaming me for his professional trajectory because the American economy does not respond to accusations. Survival required his complete intellectual focus, and true survival is entirely incompatible with denial. The rules had reappeared, and they were adapting. The autumn afternoon of 2026 arrived with a crisp, geometric brightness. I stood on the clean, minimalist concrete balcony of my new apartment, my fingers wrapped around the handle of a heavy ceramic mug filled with black coffee. The downtown Boston skyline cut a sharp, unyielding silhouette against the clear blue sky, the glass towers reflecting the cold northern light like silver mirrors. Inside my living space, there were no lavender candles burning, no performative luxury items designed to mask an underlying rot. Just clean, architectural lines, absolute data privacy, and quiet. The relational distance between my family and me was now absolute, governed entirely by structural firewalls rather than emotional volatility. We did not experience a sentimental family reunion. No symbolic hugs occurred, no tearful apologies were offered across a holiday table, and no one pretended that financial independence was an act of personal rejection. We simply moved along separate, realistic life trajectories. The sentimental illusion that biological connection obligates an individual to operate as a shared, bottomless bank account had been completely dismantled. I did not grieve the lack of emotional closeness, because proximity that relies on financial exploitation isn't closeness, it is extraction. When the dependency ended, the relationship simply dissolved into something proportional. I had reached a final, clinical conclusion about human value. Love without responsibility is just performance. Responsibility without funding is pure resentment. The cleanest form of human affection is a structured distance that protects personal resources rather than a chaotic proximity that advertises injury. The final structural payoff of this entire audit arrived at my workstation at precisely 4:15 p.m. I sat down at my steel desk, opened my corporate laptop, and logged into my secure email interface. There, sitting at the top of the unread queue, was a short, grammatically precise message from my father's new independent consulting domain. From AJNKINS consulting at SECURMI.com to Sarah JNKINS at RISKINFRESTRUCTURE.com subject. Document request archive 2024. I read the text lines twice, checking the metadata. There were no emotional triggers embedded in the text. There were no weaponized health updates from a leaner, no demands for unbacked six-figure loans, no insults regarding my character, and no psychological manipulation. By forcing him into a documented, electronic arena governed strictly by corporate compliance and email trails, I had completely cured his capacity for psychological tactics. I clicked twice, attached the verified, encrypted PDFs from my archive ledger, and hit send. The final balance sheet was perfectly clear. Bills were being paid by the specific individuals who owed them. Contracts were being signed by the operators who utilized them. Credit had resumed its proper, independent path. I never waited for their appreciation, because appreciation is entirely unnecessary when survival is achieved. They survived the pressure. I advanced into the clearance. Financial boundaries are not cruelty, They are the structural guidance that allows reality to reappear. When we look beneath the surface of these shared human struggles, the true currency of existence isn't found in a bank ledger or a signed contract, but in the quiet preservation of human dignity. True loyalty cannot be built on extraction, and love can never survive where respect is treated as an optional luxury. We often confuse enablement with devotion, carrying weights we were never meant to bear, only to realize that the heaviest burdens are the ones that shield others from the natural consequences of their own choices. Growth requires friction. It demands that we step back and allow the real world to exist exactly as it is, unvarnished and unmediated, because capability is the only true root of self-worth. When we establish boundaries, we aren't locking doors out of malice. We are building structural guidance that protects the integrity of our own lives. True strength lies in the quiet refusal to let our identity become a commodity for others to distribute, choosing instead a clean, realistic distance that honors truth over performance. Thank you so much for staying through to the very end of this journey and engaging with a narrative that values raw honesty over easy illusions. If these reflections on boundaries, unearned obligations, and the transition into true independence resonated with your own life experiences, please take a moment to share your perspective in the comments below. Your insights might provide the exact clarity someone else needs today.